Let's turn over to our next guest. Emadidin Badi joins me now from Florence, Italy. He's a fellow at the European University Institute. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to start by asking you sort of what you think of not only this conference, but conferences in general, because it could be said that these types of summits, these types of meetings are used by the international community as a tool to sort of display progress, but not real progress, but give credit to the process rather than the result. Would you agree?
I definitely agree. We've had our fair share in Libya of conferences that are pretty disconnected from the ground. This one, I would say, is no different in terms of its disconnect from the ground, in the sense that it has essentially been called or convened after Russia and Turkey announced their bilateral, let's say, summit for a ceasefire in Moscow. And I think that the Europeans really expected that the ceasefire agreement would be signed. So now they found themselves in somewhat of a quagmire with a ceasefire that hasn't really been signed. And I think that overall, the only, let's say, constructive step that could be taken in this initiative in particular would be if a ceasefire is actually signed, first of all, and agreed upon, and if there are clear monitoring mechanisms for how this ceasefire would be enforced, and also clear accountability mechanisms for violators. That's roughly where I see maybe where this conference might have a good impact on the Libyan conflict. Other than that, it hasn't really been labeled a conference per se. The German hosts have been quite clear about making it seem like a process, which is honestly a good thing, because the actual conference from the conference will emanate follow-up committees, and these are good because they'll convene all the players involved in Libya even in the future, which means that there'll be a room for having a conversation, which wasn't really the case before.
I think sort of being on air for the last 2 hours and talking to our various correspondents and guests here on set, I think the number one priority right now is to get a ceasefire signed. What was supposed to happen in Moscow should happen in Berlin. But the question now is that even if Khalifa Haftar of the LNA does promise to or does sign the ceasefire deal, is it going to be believable? Is it going to be sustainable? Because we've seen him sort of break his promises, break his commitments in the past, specifically when you look at the 2015 agreement, where he's chosen to implement some things and disregard others.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. That's why I don't think that really the ceasefire would be successful based on Haftar's word or based on Haftar's commitment, or actually any of his backers, really. The only way that I see a ceasefire being successful and actually lead to let's say, a peaceful resolution of the Libyan conflict or an actual political process is if there is actually a force on the ground that would monitor it, and if the United Nations Security Council clearly outlines what are the accountability mechanisms for violators. Otherwise, there's absolutely nothing restraining Haftar from relaunching an offensive, particularly since his main backers, his main backer haven't even been named in most of the statements 10 months back now.
So do you feel that there needs to be, first and foremost, a military resolution, a military stalemate before any of this diplomatic stuff, or whether a ceasefire can be talked and implemented?
I think there's definitely room to implement a ceasefire without using, let's say, the word military intervention. You'd have a monitoring mechanism or a monitoring team on the ground, not necessarily Libyan. And there are several states that actually displayed willingness to send a force to participate in monitoring this ceasefire, most notably Italy. Boris Johnson also mentioned that today. Turkey has showed willingness to do that. I think the Turks and probably the Russians would also want to do that as well, predominantly to have influence on the ground. But at the end of the day, it is a good way of having a ceasefire on the ground that foreign actors and domestic actors would respect, not just because of the force that is monitoring, but also if there are clear accountability mechanisms on what would happen if you violate it, because that's never really been the case in Libya. You always had agreements. You never had accountability. This conference, essentially, if it comes out without any of this, then it would be a guarantee for impunity in the future.
Why do you think the international community has been so divided on Libya up until now?
I think there are divergent interests. I think one of the primary drivers of division on Libya, at least amongst external actors, has been ideology to a certain extent. So ideology that is also influenced by personal networks and interests. And that's why we've seen, I think, different states take different approaches to resolving the Libyan conflict, but predominantly based on the actors they are they like the most based on ideology. I don't think it's necessarily not that they do not want to resolve the Libyan conflict. I think that they just have very different visions of what the Libyan state should look like. And unfortunately, what that means is that it also narrows down the space for Libyans to express themselves and have a national dialogue, something that was planned 10 months back and was unfortunately now delayed by Haftar.
All right. Ahmad Badi, thank you very much for joining us live for us in Florence.